Food, and our next guest is Karen Pedersen. She's the Managing Director of Trigg Mining. The ASX code is TMG. They're an emerging sulphate of potash producer, and they are over in WA, here to tell the story. Please welcome Karen.
Thank you, Kerry, and it is fabulous to be back here on the Gold Coast today and in person after a couple of years of doing this virtually. I hate being up there, so I'm really happy to be here today. Well, you have already heard a lot, and you will hear a lot more about a wide variety of companies exploring for and developing projects for energy sources, storage of energy, and some precious metal projects. But after all that stuff we want in our lives, and you've checked, when you've woken up in the morning and you've checked the share prices on your smartphone and your tablets and turned on the smart TV to check the news, you might flick on, or you might have already done this actually, flick on the coffee machine and start making a cup of coffee, squeeze some almonds for your almond latte, throw some sourdough in the toaster and, well, even smash a couple of avocados on that toast. But have you ever thought about the miracle of food and how it arrived on your plate? At Trigg Mining, we are looking to have a positive and sustaining impact by providing the world with essential minerals needed for both global food security and climate change mitigation. Food security is a global issue. The world's population is continuing to expand. We are demanding more food and more nutritious food per capita from less and less arable land. Simply put, we must produce more from less if we are going to feed the world. Furthermore, as recent events have highlighted significantly, we are seeing increasing use of sanctions and protectionist measures, even acts of war, through the restriction of food-related trade, impacting global food security. But first, Plant Nutrition 101. Our food and our food's food needs sun, water, carbon, oxygen, and a growing medium to grow. They also need macronutrients, otherwise known as NPK and S. And if you go down the aisle in Bunnings, if you haven't already noticed, every packet of fertiliser will have an NPK ratio, specifically targeting that type of plant growth. Where nitrogen is sourced currently from natural gas, but we've been hearing more in the news about green ammonia sourcing nitrogen from the atmosphere. Phosphorus comes from phosphate rock, which is quite different to potassium, being K. And potassium comes in two different sources. Just to confuse things, we call it potash, and we also call it muriate of potash or sulphate of potash. And Trigg is targeting sulphate of potash, and I'll explain why shortly. We also need micronutrients. These are things we often take as supplements: iron, calcium, magnesium. Plants need those too. And why we take those supplements is because we're not getting enough from our food, because our soils are depleted. And most importantly, 40 to 60% of all the food we consume on this planet is directly attributable to modern uses of fertiliser. And Liebig's Law. Liebig's Law tells us that whichever nutrient the soil is most deficient in will drive your yield. It doesn't matter how much more superphosphate or urea or whatever else you put on your soil. If you've got one nutrient that's deficient and you're not replenishing the soil with it, that drives the yield. So farmers really need to make sure they've got the right balance, particularly of the macronutrients of N, P and K. So what is sulphate of potash? Mineral element is potassium sulphate. It contains only nutrients the plants need, nothing else. It is niche, it is inelastic, it is essential, especially it's also a highly efficient fertiliser as well because it only contains those important nutrients. It's particularly important in chloride-sensitive crops, such as all your fruit, all your vegetables, your avocados, your coffee beans, grapes, tree nuts, cocoa, anything grown under glass, including flowers, especially in arid and acidic soils, which are becoming more of an issue globally in agriculture. Whereas muriate is 50% chloride, and that is detrimental to plants and soil health. It's effectively a poison. It contributes to salinity and acidity of soils and waterways. It is not environmentally sensitive. And if farmers are serious about their soil health, and we're serious about our sustainable agricultural future, we really don't want to use muriate. So SOP, being only nutrients for plant growth, is far more sustainable source of potassium, and it can be mined, or produced rather, from a sustainable mining operation, which I'll describe a little bit later. So the potash market, how big is it? Well, it's about 80 million tonnes globally, and as I said, we would supply this all with sulphate of potash if we could, but we can't. It is scarce, especially in natural form. So we have a market of about 7 million tonnes that is sulphate of potash, with only 35% of this supplied by natural sources. As I said, this is inelastic and it's supply constrained. And how we make up the rest of that market at the moment is a synthetic process where they buy muriate of potash, they buy sulphuric acid, heat it to around about 800 degrees. And as a byproduct of that, is 1.2 tonnes of hydrochloric acid needs to be disposed of to produce every tonne of sulphate of potash that we need to produce your food. Therefore, natural sources of sulphate of potash, just like what Trigg is exploring for and developing, is the only sustainable and long-term, low-carbon source of potassium fertiliser. We've got 3 projects that are looking just for this. They're all in the eastern goldfields of Western Australia, which is considered the #1 jurisdiction for mining in the world. The projects lie about 170 kilometres east of Laverton, and quite fortuitously, Lake Throssell is right adjacent to the Great Central Road, which has been bitumised right now to become the 3rd Trans-Australian highway. And that will be completed by the time we can bring this project into production. That gives Trigg and Lake Throssell a unique position, being able to access both the West Coast and the East Coast agricultural markets and access to export terminals. Lake Throssell is a high-grade discovery. We announced this just 12 months ago. It is huge. At 14.5 million tonnes, our scoping study suggests that it can host a project of about 245,000 tonnes per annum of sulphate of potash for an initial mine life of 21 years. Now, that's only 40% of our current known mineral resource, and we've only drilled half the strike length available to us. This is a substantial project of global scale and puts it in the top 10 producers globally of sulphate of potash. As I said, this is a sustainable project. What I'm talking about here is minerals dissolved in brine. It's electrolytes. And it's very much similar to Gatorade without the sugar and the colour. It sits in these big paleo valley systems. And for this project at Lake Throssell, it's draining the Gibson Desert. Over a long period of time, the rain has precipitated, dissolved the potassium-rich rocks and concentrated in the lake system with a very high evaporation rate we have in the goldfields. The processing or the development here isn't about digging the pit. It's about pumping the brine sustainably, harvesting the brine from the deposit, using trenches in the salt lake surface itself and through bores into the basal aquifer. That brine then goes into the halite crystalliser ponds. Now, halite is the chemist term for table salt, and it looks exactly like any of the coastal salt projects. But we take it another step, and that next step is to take the concentrated brine after the halite has precipitated out, to then further concentrate that into magnesium and potassium-rich salts. Then we take those salts into a process plant to purify it, simply washing it through a heating process, to produce a farm-ready product at the mine gate. Natural, Australian, mineral fertiliser for global food security. So we haven't stopped there. We've been listed just on 2.5 years, so this is a discovery in that period of time and a scoping study, and we've now embarked on the pre-feasibility study. What we've been doing there with the scoping study was to prove that we do have an economic project, because unlike a gold project, there's not a lot of rules of thumb for us to determine that. So we've dived into the detail. But as part of the PFS, we now need to broaden our horizons a little bit more and really consider the natural endowment of the project. We've got sun, a huge amount of it out there. We've got wind. There's nothing to stop the wind blowing through the desert. We also have an abundance of sulphate in that brine, which is really important. It's one of the macro fertilisers, but we also have magnesium. So we're exploring ways to truly optimise the endowment and make sure that we're creating as much value out of those products as possible and not leaving it behind. We're also looking at other process pathways. The solar evaporation process is a tried and tested method, but is there technology and innovation available to us today to speed it up, make it simpler, bring it to market earlier, those sorts of things. So we're looking at different process pathways. And all of that will ensure that we are leading with environmental stewardship, minimising waste and maximising the return for shareholders and the community as well. In the meantime, we're also working on the resource. We need to increase the confidence in the resource so that we can convert that to an ore reserve as part of the pre-feasibility study. And we're continuing the project approvals, and that's been going on now for over a year, doing the baseline survey so that we can take this project through the environmental approvals process. But wait, there's more. This is our third project, and I didn't mention Lake Raisin, but there is another deposit further to the south. It's got 6 million tonnes of sulphate of potash in it. But Lake Yeo is really exciting because it sits in the same paleo valley as Lake THROSSELL, and it's just 35 kilometres to the south. The granted tenements to the east double the strike length that we have in this paleo valley system, and the gravity survey indicates that we've got another paleo channel there about 3.5 kilometres wide. So our program coming up at Lake Yeo is to do the first drilling program, and these deposits are quite simple to define. If it's there, the drilling results will then allow us to establish an initial mineral resource for Lake Yeo as well. This will all play a part of developing a long-term sulphate of potash production hub at Lake THROSSELL on the Outback Highway. So coming back to the global thematic and what is going on, because we don't see the price of sulphate of potash flash up on our smartphones and tablets in the mornings. It has always been an incredibly steady market, and to assume a $550 a tonne price for the scoping study was pretty valid in October last year. But a lot has changed in this market. At point A, 12 months ago, the EU and the US declared sanctions against Belarus, and that affected 20% of the global supply of muriate of potash. The price started to move. 4 weeks later, the Chinese government declares a policy to prevent or to slow down exports of all fertilisers from the country to shore up its security of food supply domestically. So we are now seeing less supply of fertilisers around the world, and the prices are responding long before Russia invaded Ukraine at point C. Russia supplies another 20% of the world's muriate of potash. This is having a big impact, big disruptive impact on our food security, global supply of fertilisers. to a point that between Belarus and Russia and China, that accounts for 50% of our potassium globally. And we have to have this in our diets. We cannot produce food without it. China alone accounts for 2/3. And Australia imports all of it. Now, I have run a bit over time, so I'll flick past a few of these slides, but let you know that there's copies of the presentation at our booth. I'm happy to answer any questions. This is a boom in fertiliser world. This is a sustainable project. Again, I'll let you read that at your leisure. And the investment case in Trigg is that we've got all of this with a market cap of just $14 million at the moment.
There you go. What do you think, Karen? Well, put your hand up if you learned something from that about food and food production. And look at that. Look at that. Most of us don't have an idea. And one of the things that I took away from that as well is we import 100% of sulphate of potash into this country. So congratulations, Karen, and we wish you well on that project because Australia needs its own supply of potash. Now,